The verses, if you want to go ahead and read a verse, or on the cards, if you mind passing them around. Some of them are a little bit longer, so if you don't want to read a longer passage, find one that's a little bit shorter. I'm not sure how many we're going to get to today because there's a lot of verses and a lot to talk about, but we're going to try to get through as much as we can, obviously. The topic for tonight is the wilderness grumbling, and I'm sure we have a lot of preconceived notions in our mind about the significance of that and some of the many instances where that takes place. But the first thing I want to talk about to open up our conversation is this question: what do you do when you want to complain? Because I think we all kind of understand from a very basic perspective that complaining isn't exactly a godly attribute to go around and to complain about every little thing that bothers us. But I think we all kind of have a desire to complain, and when things don't go right or things go amiss or if we feel frustrated, we feel a desire to complain. But we don't end up doing that. At least we try not to do that. So when you want to complain, what do you do? What steps do you take to avoid that?
What do I do when I want to complain? Find somebody that will validate me, like I will feel justified in my complaint, and I will probably, let me say that.
So go and speak with someone, but you're typically referring to someone that you think is going to agree with you and like say you're justified?
Are you saying the question is like our mindset if we're trying to stop the complaining, or if we want to like let ourselves lean in and be a complainer?
If you feel the desire to complain, and we know that it's not maybe right to go and actually complain, what kind of steps do we take to remediate that? Any thoughts?
Question of what do I do when I want to complain? I usually let out a sigh, and then the complaint comes right out.
Any other thoughts?
I usually say I shouldn't say this, and I say it. And then days later, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm sorry, God, I'm supposed to talk to you about this. And it's just a repeated cycle. So clearly I haven't learned from what you're trying to get at, which is step 2, how to do that.
Yeah. I don't think we're going to see a great outline in the scripture to answer this question on what we want to do to restrain ourselves from complaining, but I like to start with this question because we're going to look at a lot of examples today of the people of Israel complaining in the wilderness, and it's really easy to point fingers and say, man, they were the worst, they complained about everything, and it's hopeful to at least start this conversation by remembering, we want to complain too, and we have things that frustrate us, and so remembering that, we actively try to stop ourselves from complaining when we often want to complain, and there were times when I'm sure they wanted to complain even more than they actually did and had to restrain themselves. So we're not immune from feeling into doing the same things that Israel did here. So here's our format for tonight's class. I went ahead and put all the verses. Like I said before, I'm not sure how many of these we're actually going to get to, but throughout the night, we're going to go through one at a time. We're going to read the verse, and I want us to try to fill out the chart. So we're going to start off by saying, what's the problem? Like, what are they complaining about? What is it that's bothering them? What are they frustrated about? What is Moses' response to the complaining? So how does he handle when people complain to him or complain about him? And ultimately, what is God's response to the complaining? And I don't have any, super insightful things actually up here on the board that I wrote in any of these boxes. So we're just going to help go through the chart and work through these things together. So let's start with the first one. Who has Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 16. Let's go ahead and open up there together. Exodus chapter 14, and let's read verses 10 through 16.
When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today you shall never see again. fight for you, and you have only to be silent. The Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff, up your staff, and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground.
Thank you. So if you see the heading in your Bible, we're talking about the crossing of the Red Sea. So who wants to answer one of these three columns? What's the problem here we're complaining about? What is Moses' response? And then what is God's response? What do we see in the text?
The people were afraid of the Egyptians coming after them.
Yeah, fear of Egypt. And why did they fear the Egyptians?
They were big and scary and kept them as slaves for a very long time. They had every right to be scared for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. It was that, or it was seemingly death.
I was going to say that they had an army and they were slaves. They didn't have weapons.
Yeah. So I think ultimately the emotion here is fear. And we've all felt fear before. Obviously, maybe not in the same circumstance that they feel, but they're at a seemingly a dead end with nowhere to go. They just escaped slavery, but ultimately they see this incredible army that's chasing after them, and they feel fear. And when faced with this fear, their response is to complain. But what is Moses' response and God's response?
Message of hope, confidence.
You say it again?
Message of hope and confidence. God's going to take care of you.
Yeah, is that God's response or Moses' response? Yeah, so Moses in verse 13 said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. I love that verse because I don't think Moses necessarily knows how God is about to bring about their salvation, but he has so much confidence that God is going to do something, that he's going to fight for his people. And so he doesn't necessarily know that they're going to part the Red Sea and walk through it, but he knows that God is not going to let his people die in this instance, which is cool. And what is God's response? Sorry, did I see a hand over here? Yeah.
He's going to work through Moses to part the sea and let them walk on dry land. And so it's just another great sign of his power and might after the plagues. Which is a crazy thing that the complaining would already start this early. I mean, when you talk about grumbling in the wilderness, in my mind, I didn't really even think we'd be in Exodus for that much of the class. But, a lot of your verses are still in Exodus where didn't they just see God's salvation? Didn't they just witness all the terrible things that he did to the Egyptians? And they're not even out of Egypt yet, and the fear and the doubt has already creeped in.
Yeah, I think fear is an extremely powerful emotion. And fear can overwhelm even the most logical brain and the most logical mind. And so when you have this fear of impending death, you're going to resort to complaining. But we see Moses has a lot of confidence in God, and then God fulfills and justifies that confidence. Verse 15, the Lord then says to Moses, tell the people of Israel to go forward, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand, and he parts the Red Sea. And I love that because Moses had this confidence in God, and he wasn't sure how it was going to come. In the very next verse, God justifies that confidence. And we see plenty of verses where people have confidence in God, and God doesn't act for years down the line or generations in the future. He fulfills his promises. But we see this is an example of literally the next verse. God backs up Moses and delivers his people, which is awesome. Yeah.
I think we also see he provided a way out, but even in the next few verses, he removed the problem, right? He said, I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They're going to chase after you, and they're going to be taken care of, that I might be glorified. So not only a way out, but he removes ultimately this ongoing problem that they might have.
Yeah, he literally solves the problem. And I think that's something that we'll see a lot in this chart, which is there's a problem that exists, and whatever God's response is ultimately the answer to the problem and takes away the thing that they're grumbling about. All right, let's move on to the next one. So this is what I had. The problem was the fear of Egypt. Moses reassures the people, and God ultimately parts the sea. So let's do Exodus chapter 15, verses 22 through 27.
Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log. And he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Then the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there tested them, saying, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I have put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water.
Thank you. So, problem, Moses' response, God's response. What do you see here?
Did you say, what's the problem? I'm sorry.
Yeah. What's the problem? What's Moses' response, and what's God's response? You can answer any of those questions.
Couldn't find anything to drink.
Yeah, no water. And we talked about they literally just come through the Red Sea, and then 3 days later, they go 3 days and they have found no water. And so it doesn't take much long, even after we see another huge, instance of God demonstrating his power. 3 days later, there's no water, and they're already complaining about that. So, it makes sense. Once again, I don't want to degrade these people. If you go 3 days without water, you're not going to be in the best mood. And even if you see God's wonderful power, it's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult. And so they end up complaining. But what is Moses' response and what is God's response? Yeah, he cries out to God. What do you say? I couldn't hear you. Let's see it in the text. So, verse 24, the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" In verse 25, and he cried to the Lord. And I love that as an answer. Once again, we see the people are complaining to Moses, and Moses immediately turns to God. So this is slightly different than his first response. His first response was to reassure the people. And then we see a different response from Moses that we're going to see consistently. This is people grumble against Moses or tell him about his problems. He immediately turns and gives those problems to God, which is really cool. And then God does what to answer out the rest of this text?
He cleans the bad water, but then gives additional fresh water. It's almost like to reemphasize, like, I'm going to take the bad water, make that good, but even if that wasn't good enough, here's some new springs that I can show you as well.
Yeah, I love that, and I really wanted to go all the way to verse 27, because I think the end of the story is really in verse 27, because the Lord hears their problems, he cleans the water becomes sweet, and then in verse 26, he gives them a statute and a rule for them to follow in the future, and then in verse 27, they are led to a place where there's 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Like, that is paradise. And if you can literally just look in this one instance and see the people have a problem, God answers that problem and transforms the water, gives them rules to live by so that they're a changed people, and then ultimately leads them to paradise. And just in those 6 verses, you see the entire gospel story. You see people complaining, you see people having problems, God transforming their lives, God giving them rules to live by that improves their lives, and then ultimately leading them to paradise. I just think this is an awesome class because it's something we're going to see over and over again, and it's almost probably going to hit you over the head how many times we're going to ask these same questions. But we see the people have problems. We see Moses trying to take care of their problems, praying to God, interceding on their behalf, and then we see God solving their problems. Any other thoughts on these specific verses?
This probably isn't the exact point for this class, but I think it's pretty cool that in this story, he fixes their problem with a tree. The log that he throws into the water, it reminds me of the cross of God. But another thing is, I wonder if, we're talking about complaining in this class, and
Yeah.
Like, that's not the opposite of complaining,
Mhm.
is to, everything's fine. No, we haven't had any water for 3 days. It's not fine.
Mhm.
It's, I don't know if there's a difference between, I mean, there is a difference between complaining, griping,
Mhm.
but I think maybe the big difference is who you're complaining to. Because Moses is griping to God, you know what I'm saying? And that's okay.
Yeah. No, I love that in verse 24. The people grumbled against Moses. Verse 25, and he cried to the Lord. So I don't know what the roots are, or what the original language is between the word grumbled and the word cried. But just in English parlance, they're not too far away from one another. It's you're complaining, you're griping, you're crying, you're frustrated, all those emotions. And the emotions are probably the same. Moses is just as thirsty as every single one of the people. And you're right, he doesn't pretend like everything is fine and normal. No, he takes those complaints and he goes and cries to God, which I think is a normal response to this type of problem. Yeah.
In addition to what Brian was talking about, there's also the water of baptism. There's a living water of Jesus. So just to further that comparison is all there.
I wasn't planning on making that big of a parallel, but the more I look at it, the more I see it. So yeah. Any other thoughts here? All right. No water. Moses cries to God. God made the water sweet. Let's go on to the next one. Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 12.
They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. On the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us? And Moses said, When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him. What are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, Come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God.
Thank you. Same three questions. What do we see in these verses?
Here's your meat. Here's your meat.
That's the problem. So last time it was no water. This time no food. Same or similar problem from last time. And what are the responses this time? Are they the same or are they different?
One day the same, they complained to Moses and then he cried out to God.
Yeah, I think they're very similar. So we see Moses' response actually coming after God's response in this verse. In verse 8, we see Moses say, When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him. What are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. So I think he's almost instructing them again this time, sort of different than last time, to say, hey, you keep grumbling against me, but you need to grumble, or you need to cry, or you need to bring these complaints to God for what am I going to do about it? But God's the one that provides you the answer. And I think it's interesting because they don't necessarily grumble directly to God. They complain to Moses and Aaron, but the Lord still hears their grumbling and answers it. Any other thoughts on that? There's another similarity between this verse and last verse that I think is interesting. Does anyone see it? I think the idea of testing is really interesting, and we see in verse 25 of chapter 15, it says, the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them. And then, where is it in this verse? Anyone see it in chapter 16? Yeah, verse 4. The Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. What are our thoughts on God testing his people in these circumstances?
I think he's building a relationship of reliance. I've not noticed this before, but I've been trying to mark little timestamps. Right, the last passage was 3 days after the Exodus. Now we're 2.5 months after the Exodus. I think the joy and excitement of deliverance is probably starting to wear off. But God is making it known to them that I'm not just setting you free from Egypt and we can part our separate ways. No, I'm building a covenant with you. And we're going to have to work on this whole reliance issue because you're going to be my people forever. And giving the daily needs through food is just one way that he shows his provision, but they have to be obedient to him and want that relationship as well.
Yeah, we talked about the foreshadow of salvation in the last verse. And I think you see here that, God isn't just forgetting about his people. It's been 3 days. I guess I forgot to give water. Or, it's been a long period of time. I guess I forgot to give them food. No, he's specifically withholding some of his blessings in order for them to do exactly what you said, build a greater reliance on him. I think that's really fascinating. Erica?
Sometimes when I think about testing, I think about those videos of, putting candy in front of a 3-year-old and saying, like, don't eat this, and then leaving the room. Like, my 4-year-old would fail that test. And I think sometimes I think of testing as, like, setting someone up, expecting them to fail. But I think more this testing is, like, you have well prepared for a test in college, and you should know all of the material, and it should be a measure of success versus this entrapment that we sometimes think of with testing. And so the Israelites often fail these tests, but God has given them everything they have that they need to succeed.
Yeah, I love that analogy because this also isn't a final exam. We see some tests later where God gets so angry and frustrated by their response, he does kind of lash out against his people. Hopefully we can read some of those today. But this isn't one of those circumstances. It's still very much a preliminary test to hopefully build that reliance that he doesn't have to execute his judgment quite yet. So that is interesting too. And I think we'll see God's responses change as we go through and see some of these tests. In the beginning, God is as loving and merciful as he ever is, freely giving water, 70 palm trees and 12 springs when they need water, and raining down his abundance in food, after this trial here. But we'll see after we get to some of the later verses here, after it's complaint after complaint after complaint, God's response isn't as merciful as we necessarily think it should be.
Seems to be our human nature to complain sideways to other people and not directly to authority. That we seem to do that a lot. In my own life, I do that. It's easy to complain to somebody else, but not the actual person that's in charge. And I think God's trying to teach them that cry out to me, or come to me, not don't be complaining to Moses or each other.
Yeah, it's like you have a problem with your boss and you love to talk about it with all your other coworkers and employees, but you don't want to actually go and talk to that person and address the problem. It's probably something similar. Any other thoughts on this verse? All right, so that's what I had. Let's move on to the next one, Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7.
all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" The people thirsted there for water. The people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. You shall strike the rock, and the water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?"
Thank you. I think this is very similar to the one we read before, so I'll go ahead and throw up there what I had. A couple of things that are different that I think are worth noting here. The phrase in verse 4, "They are almost ready to stone me." We see the increased aggression of the people, and they're not necessarily learning from their tests. Instead, they're turning around and testing God, which I think is interesting. They're turning what's supposed to be a test to increase their own reliance into a test of God's patience. And then, what was the second thing? Oh, the staff that is used here to strike the rock is the same staff which struck the Nile, which I think is fascinating because you see all of God's power and deliverance in the actual exodus and the leaving of Egypt, and then God is saying, you lift up that staff that you used to part the sea and strike this rock. And I think it's another reminder to God's people, hey, remember what I did for you in the past, as we talked about a couple classes ago. This thing that God uses as his signet ring, the leaving of Egypt. He's reminding his people again just from the raising of the staff. Remember what I did for you in the past, and I can do it for you again. Any thoughts on this verse? Seeing none, we can go ahead and move on to Numbers, and we're going to read Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. So you can go ahead and flip there. Numbers chapter 11, and let's read verses 1 through 3.
Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused. Then fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So that place was called Taberah, because fire from the Lord had burned among them.
Thank you. So this is a short verse, and I'll throw up there what I had. We don't really know necessarily what they're complaining about. We could probably take some educated guesses, but we know that after all of these trials and tests, they're still complaining. And this time, their complaining is so much so that God lashes back out against his people and burns parts of the camp. And it's Moses' response in verse 2 that ultimately gets God to relent. The people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. I think this is interesting because in chapter 11, verse 1, it says, the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, and the Lord heard it. But I don't necessarily think they're complaining to God. It's not like they're praying to God, asking for deliverance and talking about their misfortunes and prayers to God, but they're complaining in the presence of God, and God is hearing them and getting frustrated. And instead of praying to God for him to relent to his anger or taking their concerns to God after God burns part of the camp, they cry out to Moses again. And I think you see this as another common theme throughout. The people love going to Moses and Aaron and complaining and asking for things. But what they refuse to do is go to God, which is ultimately what Moses himself does. He prays to the Lord, and that's ultimately what causes the fire to die down. Any thoughts on these verses?
I almost love that we don't know specifically what so late in the game that it's really just a culture of complaining. I'm sure that we maybe have, workplace cultures that might be like this, or old friend groups or whatever, but that's the conversation of the day. Hey, how are you doing? What's the weather like? What do we have to complain about? And it becomes such a culture that maybe that is what instructed the Lord's anger, is that it is so constant and so prevalent among my people that I'm going to send them this sign.
Yeah, I wonder also if there's, we see before they have this specific problem they're complaining about, food or water or fear, and God answers all of those things. And now we're getting to a certain type of complaining that's just complaining about our misfortunes. It almost feels like complaining just for the sake of complaining. And there's no specific request for God to fulfill, and so he ends up getting angry, which I think is interesting. If they were to complain or to bring to God a specific request, God is faithful to fulfill those requests. But instead of doing that, it's just this general complaining about misfortunes. Other thoughts? All right, let's move on to the next one. We're at Numbers chapter 11, and it's literally the next verse. So verses 4 through 17. This is a bit of a longer passage. Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 through 17.
Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. The people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of deli. People went about and gathered it, and ground it in hand mills, or beat it in the mortar, and boiled it in the pot, and made cakes of it. The taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his kin, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly. And Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give birth, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I'm not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once. I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and the officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take a stand there with you. And I will come down and talk with you there, and I will take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear the burden yourself alone."
Thank you for reading that longer passage. What do we see here in these verses?
I was kind of waiting for this one. It's always been one of the most helpful for me to show what the complaining really looks like. And especially in verse 4 and 5. "Oh, that we had meat." They had a strong craving. And it's amazing how just how real the scriptures are. What they say is just the way people complain today. Oh, our whole being, we're just gonna die. And I think what maybe I missed a lot on the complaining, because I just kind of looked at it as, oh yeah, that's why the Israelites didn't make it to the promised land, and they whined. But to look at it from God's point of view, how disgusting it is. And it's helpful for me. One time somebody explained, imagine a kid coming to you and just saying, I'm going to die if I don't get something to drink, or I just don't know, are we going to have dinner? Are we going to have food? How insulting that would be for your kid to say that. I mean, come on. Of course I'm going to take care of you. And that's putting ourselves in God's
Yeah, I think you made a lot of really interesting points there, and those are things that I've also thought about. I think the idea of craving is really interesting to me because it's not that they were without food or without water. It was they were craving these very specific foods that they had in Egypt. And so at this point, they're complaining not necessarily about substance, but about things that are extravagant or things that are extra special. And they complain to Moses, and then I think we see also Moses, if you want to use the word, complaining to God. And I think that's really interesting because we see different responses. We see different responses from God to the way that he reacts to the people's complaining and the way that he reacts to, quote unquote, Moses' complaining. So we see the people complain about this craving. And then in verse 10, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly. God was very angry at this complaining about this craving. But all the people are complaining to Moses and throwing it at his doorstep. And then Moses turns, starting in verse 11, and he says to God, hey, I'm struggling. The people are complaining to me. There's too much work. Like, you could very much call what Moses is saying complaining, but because of his relationship to God and because of Moses' reliance on God and because Moses constantly goes to God, what does God do? He answers his prayer, and he talks about appointing these people, and he gets him help. Moses complains about this problem, and God solves that problem. I think that's fascinating because we see over and over and over again, they complain about a very specific problem, God fixes that problem. Specific problem, God fixes that problem. And then we get to a point where the people of Israel just complain about everything, and God stops just fixing their problem over and over again. He just gets angrier and angrier. But even amidst that anger, when Moses, a faithful servant, asks God for something, he immediately gives it to him and gives him the help that he requests. I think that's awesome. We're running a little low on time, so what I'm going to do is just go ahead and throw up all of them and just ask if you can take a quick 30 seconds or so and look through that list. Is there anything that sticks out to you or any patterns that you see overall between all of these things, between all of these examples of complaining? Sorry, Rob, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, we're going to cheat a little and go back to Exodus 16th chapter. I should have said this while we're still there, but in talking about God providing the manna, one of the things that's interesting to me is that God did this 6 days of the week, and then we find out from like verses 25 through 32 of that chapter that they went out on the seventh day of the week, and it just wasn't there. It wasn't. And I think the point that I want to at least bring to your attention tonight about that is that what a weekly reminder that God is in control. I mean, sometimes we think they're out there in the wilderness for 40 years and they haven't had any signs from God that He's still leading them, that He's still in charge, that everything's going to be fine. They haven't had any signs since the Red Sea. Since they walked across on dry land. That's just not the case. I mean, notwithstanding all these other things you've got up there on the board, where they prayed, where Moses interceded, and God did something, provided water, all of those things too. But every week, 6 days a week, the manna was there, and the seventh day, it wasn't. Did they just get so used to that? They thought it was arbitrary. They thought it was like the cicada that comes up once every 17 years or something like that. I mean, that is a message from God to me that He said, no, on the Sabbath day you're going to rest. So you're not going to go there. You're not going to gather. Get enough on Friday because you're not going to do this on Saturday. It's just that's a sign of God's power, and they had it right in front of them. And yet, just as you indicated, it's a great chart. They kept complaining and thinking that God wasn't going to take care of their needs when there was this weekly sign that He was in control.
Amen. I don't typically think I have a huge problem with complaining, and then you brought up the cicadas, and I'm like, yeah, I complained a lot about the cicadas. Yeah, Dave?
Their distress was their protest. And I was thinking about how does this connect in the New Testament, the warnings or
Yeah, maybe November is a really good time for this lesson because maybe the opposite of complaining is thankfulness. And if we're going to be in a stage of life or a period of a few weeks where we're really focusing and thinking about thankfulness, then yeah, it's the complete opposite of complaining. Two things I want to just point out from this chart that I think are interesting. First one, we see as I was going through this, the problems they're complaining about are the same problems over and over and over again. These aren't new problems. They complain about the same things over and over again. And then lastly, Moses, we'll have a whole lesson when we talk about this specific story, but Moses is constantly interceding and crying to God and taking care of the people. And then ultimately it's too much. And Moses himself disobeys in response to the complaining. And he disobeys God, and because of that, he doesn't enter the promised land. You think Moses, over and over again, every single time they complain, intercedes for them and acts on their behalf and prays to God on their behalf. But one time Moses disobeys, and he still has to suffer the consequences of his sin. And we'll talk more about that, but I think that's fascinating. Our takeaway for tonight, the people complained to Moses constantly, and it made God angry. Nevertheless, Moses interceded for the people and appealed to God's merciful character on their behalf. Thank you all.